So, so what?
She's illiterate.
No, again, if the function is that she should have da'at, so then she has to understand, right? But if what I'm saying now is that it may very well be that writing is good enough, but not because writing is gilui da'at, but writing is good enough because writing constitutes Amirah. And then it has nothing to do with what she understands or not. She would have to understand anyway what's going on, but not because of the writing, because you need her da'at. But that would be a different issue, okay? If she's, if she has some sort of disability and she doesn't understand social context, she doesn't understand she's standing under the chuppah and that means she's getting married, right? So that would be a different problem.
No, but it's also not, in other words, the Amirah is the mirror image of the dat. Last week he was much more focused on her dat, and the Amirah is much more about his dat.
No, it depends. If you view the Amirah as part of the Lekicha, then it's not part. Then there has to be dat. That's an independent requirement, right? That you need dat. Either you need dat because dat makneh, or you need dat because ki kach ishisha v'alcha v'ayta l'ishacher, that you need dat in kiddushin, right? That was the two deot in Rashi. Okay, but that's a separate thing. You may require Amirah because that's what the Lekicha is, not because of dat. That's Lekicha. In order to do what?
So
it's a formula. In other words, look, giving an object or giving a shtar or relating to bia that way it's a ritual. So there's a ritual where you give something, and there is a ritual where you say something. So it's a ritual, right? But it's a ritual that creates. That doesn't make any sense, right? It makes sense that in order to create an exclusive relationship, at least from the standpoint of the woman, right? There's an Isra Eshet Ish, that in order to create that, there has to be some sort of verbal pronouncement, like a neder, so to speak, right? So then that doesn't have to do with his dat. In addition to that, we would require dat, right? But the ritual, the action, is comprised of a physical action, namely keser shtar bia, and a verbal pronouncement, which is also a physical action, right? It starts with the vocal cords, it's chituch sfatayim, right, etc. Okay? So whether we require Amirah to accompany shtar, that question may be dependent on whether the Amirah is dat, is a gilui dat, or something, or part of the lekicha. If it's a gilui dat, then I don't need it because it's written. But if it's part of the lekicha, I could say I still require it. I still would require Amirah alongside the shtar, but not necessarily. It could be that in shtar I don't require physical speech because the written word is also tantamount to physical speech. And then even in kesef and bia, if he writes her a note, that's also good because ktiva is also considered Amirah. Right? Okay. I mean, and, everyday occurrence, if I say, I said in an article that I wrote. Right? People talk like that all the time. I said in my ktav, because people speak through the pen.
Is it possible to make a general statement in the other sugya about whether ktiva functions in there? Like, is there a general...
Yes, I just said. So that there's a general thing about whether ktiva functions as Amirah and all sorts of halachot.
Is there one way that we're generally offering? Like, is it possible to we generally say ktiva does function as Amirah?
You'd have to get into the Akronim because it's not muchra early on. Because I think there's a tshuva of Rabbi Kiva Eger about Shavua. The Akronim talk about Shavua B'Ktav and things like that. It's not even mentioned. It's not mentioned in Masech Shavuot. Masech Nedarim. They don't talk about what happens if you do a neder or a Shavua B'Ktav. It's something that they talked about later. So it'll still be up in...
Shuva needs
what?
Shuva.
Yeah.
Shuva. Sham nubagat.
That's a different vidui.
That's vidui.
Vidui, yeah, okay,
that's
that's
it. There's this very interesting discussion about this, about in Sfiras HaOmer, about whether you can be Yosei Sfiras HaOmer by writing it down.
Right, just
that's one of the classic.
Yeah, it's another example.
Yeah.
So then once you talk about that, if you say there's shitot like by Zayin Nikim that you need Amirah, that they learn that from Sfirat HaOmer.
Right,
we don't pass in that way. But then could a woman be Yosei by Ktiva, right? Hayom, Yom, Rishon, all these different... you have to really investigate each area separately and look at what it requires. Okay? Okay. So that, okay, with regards to shtar, okay? With regards to bia, okay? Take a look here. Requirement of Amirah by bia. So we said the Rambam and Rashi agree that you need Amirah by bia. So the question here is, we have a principle, which is Ein Adam Oseh Bilato Bilad Znut. There's a chazaka like that, okay? Whether chazaka still applies today, whatever. But there's a chazaka like that Ein Adam Oseh Bilato Bilad Znut. So the question is here, you look in the Shulchan Aruch. Let's read the Shulchan Aruch here. In Siman Lamed Gimel. B'bi'ah Ketzad. Okay? Siman Lamed Gimel is Ketzad Isha Mitkadeshet B'bi'ah. Agree with me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. B'bi'ah Ketzad. Amar la b'fnei shnei edim. Har'el mikudeshet li b'bi'ah. Right? So it's Amirah. B'bi'ah zo. V'nityachei ma b'fneihem. Har'el zo mikudeshet. Afal gab de chutzpahi. Right? That's a takana of Rav. Rav, right? In early Amoraim, they already made Gzeira and Isser to Mekadesh B'bi'ah. Rav mangid amand Mekadesh B'bi'ah. Rav would give Malkot if someone was Mekadesh B'bi'ah. Okay? But she's Mekudeshet. Okay? Bein Shabala Kedarka, Bein Shalo Kedarka. Okay. Fine. Then he says, let's continue here. Ve'ein dina ela ka'arusa kimo orasa, because kiddushin is not nisuin, v'lo kinesua. Ve'yesh umrim dafka shabala beveit chamiv, because he lo ichnisa l'rshuto. We'll talk about this when we talk about chuppah. Okay? So, but here, so it's only the maaseh biyah without bringing her into his home. That's why she's still an arusa. Aval kinsa lebeito uva aleha, o shekidesh kvar uba aleha, dina kinesua. Okay. Yesh omrim de panui habala pnuya lifnei edim chosheshin shema kivein l'shem kiddushin. It's a suffix. Why? The chazaka ein adam oseh bilato bilad znut. If they had relations in secret, so that you don't have a chazaka of ein adam oseh bilato bilad znut. The chazaka is only when you have some sort of suffix. Right? But if people acted as if it's znut, so then you assume that it's znut. Right? But if somebody publicly had relations, in other words, he said in front of Edim, they took her into his home, and they had relations, so a choshesh, or common law, right, where it's not, the behavior is not a behavior of bilad znut, right? So choshin shema kivein l'shem kiddushin. Okay? So the question here is, you're reading this and you're saying, but one second, we say that you have to say Har'el mikudeshet li in bia, right? That's what the Shulchan Aruch paskin, like the Rambam and Rashi, right? B'bi'ah ketzad, amar la b'fnei edim, Har'el mikudeshet li. So here, if it's a suffix, but what happened? Did he say it or didn't he say it? Right. If he didn't say it, so then it's not mikudeshet.
It's not mechaber. It's a yesh omrim in the Ramah. So it could be a shita that is chayav. You do need Amirah.
No, you need Amirah.
No, but
it's not what she said, right? She didn't say anything.
No, I know, but it's a yesh omrim in the Ramah. It could be, there is no shita that you don't need.
Right. So let's see. Okay. Choshin shema kivein l'shem kiddushin. So the Beit Shmuel says shema kivein. Okay. Af l'mashkat b'siman chavav afilu im shneim nitkavnu l'shem kiddushin im lo amru b'feirush shemekadesh ota lo havi kiddushin. So what happened? So you need Amirah, unless of course you have dibru me'oto inyan, but we're not talking about that case. Yeah. Mikol makom kan leman de'amar de'ein oseh bilato bilad znut havi ki'ilu amar.
In other words, in a world where there's either bilad znut or kiddushin, then it's ki'ilu amar.
Ki'ilu amar. So what does that mean?
But only in a world where there's only those two.
Well, let's live in the ideal world for a moment, right?
Who says that's
Sorry. I apologize. My litmus and klippus are coming out. In any case, my Shabbat Hatzion days are coming out. So can't shake it. as much as you try. So what he's saying here is that this is another example of a substitute for the Amirah. What did we say? If the Amirah constitutes the Lekicha, is part of the Lekicha, then there's no substitute for it. Okay? If the Amirah is just so we understand what the dot is, so then since Ein Adam Oseh Bilato Bilat Znut, so we know that this is his kavanah. Right? So then you don't need the Amirah. It means if you have the Chazaka, under the circumstances that you have the Chazaka, you don't need the Amirah. That's what's implicit from the Shulchan Aruch, and that's what the Beit Shmuel says. Even though in general you need Amirah, right? Or Dibru Ba'oto Inyan, right? And we said there are two ways of understanding that, right? If you have Chazaka, then you don't need the Amirah. That means there's a substitute for the Amirah, and the function of the Amirah is Gilui Dat. So because I know that Ein Adam Oseh Bilato Bilat Znut, there's no bigger Gilui Dat. The fact that he's having relations with her is a Gilui Dat. Right? Because Ein Adam Oseh Bilato Bilat Znut, so his kavanah must be L'Shem Kiddushin. Right? So that's Choshishin L'Kiddushin. So maybe that's what is Choshishin L'Kiddushin. Choshishin might be, we're not sure what his dot is, or Ein Adam Oseh Bilato Bilat Znut is a suffix, right? We're not sure about that chazaka. Or the suffix might be in the realm, actually, well, he didn't say it. It's just that you only have a chazaka. So maybe you need to say it, and the chazaka isn't good enough. Right? So that's the question. Okay? So that's another nafkamina, which is actually very important.
This is connected to the Yeduim B'Tzibur? Or no?
Yeah, this is a question, right?
But this is what it is?
Yeah, this is case of Yidua B'Tzibur.
This is
right?
Yidua B'Tzibur.
Yeah.
From this, there is the safek around Yeduim B'Tzibur.
Right, exactly.
And
Right.
is it right that the Yesh Omrim are assuming a world in which there's either Bilat Znut or Bilat Kiddushin, and there's no...
No, how you define Bilat Znut goes back to our whole discussion about Pilegish. If Pilegish is mutter, so it's not Bilat Znut. Right? There could be three possibilities. You could have a Bilat Znut, which is Aser. Okay? And what the Isser is also a separate question. What's Isser Darais and Isser Darabanan, whether it's Mitzad, whether it's a Bittul Aseh, whether it's a Mitzvat Lo Taseh, Lo Tiakdesha. That we talked about. Okay? So you have Bilat Znut. Then you can have a Bi'ilah of Kiddushin, and you could have a Bi'ilah, which is not a Bilat Znut and not a Bi'ilah of Kiddushin, if you hold that Pilegish is mutter.
But the Yesh Omrim can't be in that opinion.
All the Yesh Omrim, which Yesh Omrim?
יש אומרים, זה פנוי הבעל הפנויה לפני עדים, חוששים
שם מכיוון לשם קידושין.
Why? כי חזקה אין אדם עושה בילתו בילת znud. But in a world where
there's right, okay,
נכון,
that's true.
ויש אומרים,
So he's
it's
assuming
in a binary world.
that Pilegish is Aser. Because you don't say that...
That Pilegish is Asur, or that there's no even fourth option of why people have bilot.
How you define Bilat, look, if you say, in a world where you have, say, people living together and they're not interested in getting married, but they're living together, so you would say, you're not choshesh for kiddushin. And the Chazal, that's basically saying that there are circumstances, and the who talks about this, the Sridei Eish has a tshuva about this in his discussion. Sridei Eish has a tshuva about civil marriages, right? And he has a discussion of whether you use the chazaka of Ein Adam Oseh Bilato Bilat Znut when you have this possibility of living together without kiddushin. Exactly. He says there that even though they don't have kavana, he pulls it in the other direction. Ein Adam Oseh Bilato Bilat Znut. So even if they don't have kavana for kiddushin, but they still don't want to be Bilat Znut, so she's still mikudeshet, right? Because the mistama want to be together. They don't mean it for znut. So even though they're not saying they want kiddushin, not thinking about kiddushin, but they are married because they don't want to be laznut. Because you could say normally the fact that people are panuya bal panuya means that the chazaka doesn't apply to them. They do want to be laznut. So he's saying no. Sometimes the panuya bal panuya is not be laznut. It's not it. So therefore the kiddushin does apply.
That's what the Sridei does. But I'm saying, but
right.
okay.
Making it.
But the Yesh Omrim would only work. Again, in a binary world.
Right. This could
Once
be a
you're in
good
a more
proof that the
complex
mechaber
reality-
doesn't hold that from the heter of pilegish. Right? Even if it's only midrabanan, even if the isur pilegish is only midrabanan, but lamaisa there's no heter pilegish. So then it would be considered bilatznut, either midoraita or midrabanan, and there's a chazaka that's not what a person wants, unless you know that that's what they want, right? But otherwise, in the lack of clarity, the situation is not clear. So we assume they don't want it. So then the kavanah is for kiddushin. There's no amirah. You don't need amirah because you have a chazaka that this is the intention. Then that's tantamount to the amirah, and that means that the function of amirah is only gilui dat. If you required amirah as part of the kiddushin, then the chazak of ein adam oseh bilato bilatznut would not be sufficient.
Based on his chashash is shema kiven l'shem kiddushin, which itself if the chashash that implies that we can use the be'ilah as an evidence of birur dat, then he undermines that birur dat by saying shema kiven l'shem kiddushin. His whole principle is that we're choshesh because we don't know his dat. So how can you say we know
Well,
we don't
it's
know
a
his dat?
we'll require a get. Will require a get misafek.
If the whole point of if we're saying that the be'ilah, the act, substitutes for a birur dat has to do birur dat by definition, but he says we don't know whether he was kiven the kiddushin, so he undermines. He can't call it a birur dat. He's saying, as he's writing this might be a birur dat, he's saying we don't know what his dat is. So how can you say that the dat was being
Because maybe he's kiddushin, so maybe there isn't enough dot there. Maybe we do say.
But then we don't have the birur. Because he says, I don't know. Like, how can he call
But
it
they're
birur
two
and then say, I
sides.
don't know?
I know, that's a good point.
No, because
That's
he's
like a catch-22.
saying there is
That-
only one
that's
other
what he wrote
possibility,
it.
which obviously people don't want.
Look, the way he read
Nachon?
the way you explain the Yashomrim, he should say Shema.
It sounds like if I say chazak ein adam oseh bilato bilatznut, that sad means we do know his dot.
Right, and the Shema should be, I don't know what Amirah means. Is Amirah about a birur dat? Is Amirah about something formal?
Or he's assuming
But
that
Shema
Amirah
isn't-
is Beirur, and the question is, can you apply the chazak?
Right, but
Yes, Makidim,
it's
Makor
weird
That's a person
to
that's
be willing to accept something as birur dat when you acknowledge that you are not
But
sure
this-
about the dat.
No, the not sure is on a different
I
level.
think so.
If I apply the chazaka, then I am sure. And if I don't apply the chazaka, I'm not
So
sure.
Choshesh is
Right?
on whether we apply it.
Whether we apply the chazaka and then all the ramifications of applying the chazaka, or don't apply the chazaka, then all the ramifications of not applying the chazaka. Okay.
But it would depend.
So that's a second. That's with regards to Amirah by Bia. Okay. If we say, and this is again, there's no shita in Rishonim that says this, but it would make. But I'm just saying this because of the way the Gemara talks about it. If we say that you only need Amirah in Kesef, right, and in Shtar and Bia you don't need Amirah. Okay, let's just explore that as a possibility. Maybe some Rishon says it. I wouldn't be surprised, but I didn't find anybody. Right? That actually makes sense. Okay.
From the original Tosefta that we
The original Tosefta just says it by Kesef.
And none of the Rishonim follow through with that.
Right. None of the Rishon that I saw. Okay. Say that dafka by Kesef, but by Shtar and Bia you don't require Amirah. But let's just go with that possibility because I think it helps understand the dynamics here. I could say that the Amirah is required to make the Lekicha a Lekicha of Kiddushin, but only in Kesef. Because Kesef is, what's the word when something has a double meaning? It's a,
Ambiguous?
what? No, there's another word for this, a specific word for it. It's not an English word. It's, what? No, I'm thinking in Hebrew. There's an English term for it. When something has a double meaning. Like a double entendre. Kesef is something which is from the world of kinyanim. Okay? Shtar, it says Har'el Mekudeshet in the Shtar. Bia is Bia, it's a Ma'aseh of Ishut. Right? Not because of Chazak Einam Dasan Bilat or Bilat Znut. Because it's an act of Ishut. So shtar and bia are lekichat ishut by all by themselves. Kesef could be understood as a matana or as kiddushin. So what constitutes kesef of kiddushin? Kesef cannot stand on its own 2 feet in kiddushin, because it also means kinyan. So in order that kesef should be a kinyan ishut and not a kinyan mamon, we require amirah. By analogy, saying Hilchot Shabbat, okay? There are certain melachot, right? Melachot need kavanah to go along with them, and that usually is associated with the halacha of melechet machshevet. Okay? But there are certain melachot that even if you let go of the requirements of melechet machshevet, they still need kavanah. For example, zomer, right? Zomer, in order to be chayav for zomer, you need tzarich la'etzim. You need kavanah tzarich la'etzim. Even if in general you don't require melach she'en tzarich l'gufa, let's say there's machlok tanaim on that, but b'chol in zomer you need tzarich la'etzim, because the act of zmirah, just cutting off the tree in order to be chayav for kotzer, it could mean something else. Sometimes da'at is used to reinforce the action, because the action all by itself is ambiguous. Or by binyan b'kelim. Binyan b'kelim, because there's no specific action in binyan. Like normally, kotev, we know what kotev is, but what's binyan? Binyan is sometimes binyan can be taking one stone, putting on another stone. Sometimes binyan can be knocking a nail into the wall. Binyan can be all sorts of things. It doesn't have a specific action. So binyan is more tied to an expression of intent together with the action. Okay? So that by way of analogy. So kesef is like that. Kesef is not clearly ishut. So kesef needs amirah. The other things are clearly ishut. The shtar, it says, Har'el Mekudeshet. Bia is bia. Okay? So it would make sense. I think it's a very strong argument to say that dafka kesef needs amirah. And this actually feeds in, we'll talk about this in coming weeks, that the Rambam says that kesef is midrabanan, or kesef is midivrei sofrim. Rabotav shel Rashi say that kesef is midrabanan. Why is that? Because bia and shtar is clearly a maaseh shut. Kesef by itself is not really a maaseh shut. It's borrowed from a different world, right? And that's why you need amirah by kesef. That would work out very nicely. But that's my little theory. Okay? Right. Okay.
Can I just ask a question on Bilat Znut? I understand.
On what?
Just the concept of Bilat Znut, like what defines Bilat Znut as opposed to Bishut in any other context, whether it's Pilegesh or Nisuim. Isn't it the monetary transaction in general? Like
that's a machloket. That's a machloket.
It's a machloket? It's not clear?
No. What's considered in the two things? What's considered the Isser Zona? That's machloket Rishonim. Whether it involves Ishambu Shekeret Lakol and taking money, right? Or it's the way I think the Ramban says, any Bia Asura is Lotia Kadesha, but it has to be Biot Asurot. Otherwise, Biot Asurot. In other words, Gilei Arayot or something like that. But Panuya Panuya is not included in that Isser, right?
Why?
It's not. That's what the Ramban thinks. They're based on Sugyot and Yevamot, right? That it involves only an Isser Arayot. So every Isser Arayot has two Isurim, right? Right. Every Isser Arayot has two Isurim. There's the particular Isser Erva, and there's an Isser Znut.
But it's not if you're over on an Isser Doraita.
We over two Isser Doraita.
It's not considered Znut.
No, so the Nida is different for a number of reasons, right?
According to this there.
Right. Okay. Right. So that's a separate issue. In terms of Bi'ilat Znut, for the purposes of when you talk about being married, when it's not Gilui Arayot, what's called Bi'ilat Znut, Pashtut is that the Bi'ilat Znut is a bi'ah which takes place outside of a framework which involves some sort of mutual obligation and permanence.
So
Right?
anything
That's why,
not kiddushin.
in other words, anything, well, no,
Sheli.
pilegesh can also be permanent, right? There's a misgeret for it, or avdut is a misgeret, right? An eved knani is mutar b'shivcha knanit, right? So avdut is a misgeret. There's something, it's not happening, znut is without any misgeret. So here there's a misgeret, right? So it could be a misgeret of eved ivri, it could be a misgeret of pilak shut and melech, right? That's different according to the Rambam. It could be pilak shut in general, right? Especially if pilak shut has kiddushin, right? And certainly it's when there's kiddushin, right? That's why, for example, we'll talk about ketubah bezrat Hashem, where the takan of ketubah, so Rabbi Meir says, kol hapochet libtula mimatayim o la'almana mimaneh. In other words, if you give less, the husband guarantees less money than according to the takana. Harei zeh bo'el bilato bilat znut. That means if there's no ksuba, even if there's kiddushin, midrabanan, that's considered bilat znut. So what does that mean? Why is that bilat znut? It doesn't just say you want mekayim takana. It's bilat znut because the function of the ketubah, the takana, is to reinforce the marriage. So if the woman doesn't have security because the husband can megarish her if she burns the toast, so then so that's bilat znut. She's moseret at atzma to this man, where she's not sure that they're going to be married tomorrow. So even though there is kiddushin, midrabanan, that's also called bilat znut. So they created some sort of financial bulwark to support the kiddushin, to make it more permanent. Rabbanim weren't happy. Kiddushin wasn't strong enough. They still thought that it's like a bilat znut. Okay? So that's what I think would be bilat znut.
Well, could it also be that the fact that once you had those safeguards in part, if the whole point of not, if the whole thing that distinguishes that relationship from znut is the fact that you're within the framework, so by not using this ketubah mechanism once it's in place, you put yourself outside the framework.
I don't understand. What? I don't understand what you said.
Okay, so if we're defining znut as a sexual relationship that's outside the framework, dato or whatever.
Right.
So once there's a ketubah system in place, and that's considered part of the system, then by saying we're not going to use this part of it,
we're not going to use the ksuba, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then you've taken yourself outside of the framework. If the whole keta is that you need the whole is
right. So that's why Rabbi
framework.
Meir said that if you don't have a ksuba, that's oseh bilato bilat znut. That's why if the ksuba gets lost, you have to write another ksuba, and they can't be together until they write the ksuba.
But the norm today is that ketubot aren't enforced; they're not used.
Right, I know. So that probably changes the whole business. I think thought has to be given. Because the ketubah is not enforced because there's mechila right away, and whatever other.
It's pretty automatic at this point. Yeah.
You really have to talk to somebody that actually does family law to know how automatic it is. But I think certainly in any settlement, they settle on they come to whatever agreement. Yeah. They come to whatever agreement, and then the ketubah, she's mochelet. The ketubah is part of the agreement. So forget about the ksuba. I take half the apartment. I take, and the ksuba. This is in lieu of my ksuba.
Except in very rare cases, it's basically a part of Siddur Get.
It's what?
I mean, it's basically like
the what is part of Siddur Get? The settlement.
the settlement, yeah. Meaning the mechila and the
I
ketubah.
think that it's pretty automatic now. I don't think that
So then
even considers it a possibility.
Right. Okay. So whether that applies today, right? So then it wouldn't be a bilat znut without a ksuba. The ksuba doesn't fulfill that function anymore. Because it's lo kala bein av l'garsha
But
anyway.
then it's kind of undoing I don't know whether it was officially a technical. It's undoing something that was.
If nobody relates to it that way, so then it probably doesn't fulfill that function anymore. Right? The ketubah is moot. It's mostly symbolic today. Right? Okay. Let's talk about. We'll try to explore that when we talk about ketubah. Let's talk about a double ring ceremony. Double ring ceremony is when the man is mekadesh, right? Natanhu ve'amarhu. It's not a case of natanhu ve'amrahi. It's natanhu ve'amarhu, natnahi ve'amrahi, right? the Gemara never thought about that as a possibility, right? So what could be the problem, right? So if he is Mekadesh, right? He's Natanhu v'amarhu. She's Mekudeshet. Afterwards, she gives and she says, so what? Right? She can stand on her head. She can do all sorts of things. So Natan, in other words, he performed the kiddushin. Kedat v'kedin. She's Mekudeshet. Anything that happens after that, unless it's a get, or she shoots him under the chuppah, right? Then, but after they're married, right? Then there's just get and bisa sabal is the way out, right? But right, so that once she's mekudeshet. So so you want to say, can you do a double ring ceremony? So then the says, why not? She's mekudeshet. Whatever happens afterwards, happens afterwards. So that in principle is what Rav Moshe says. In principle, right? That Natanu v'amarhu, that's it, she's mekudeshet. And doing a double ring ceremony doesn't change anything. She's still mekudeshet, right? But his substantial concern is that it's misleading, that people will think that the woman can also be mekadesh, right? And then you're afraid that if you allow the woman to be mekadesh afterwards, so then there'll be situations where the man is in mekadesh and the woman will be mekadesh, right? So in other words, you're misrepresenting the halacha, right? So that's his primary concern. He has these other concerns about derech goyim and things like that. I have no idea what happens different, how the mekadesh or how they do it in other religion. But his primary concern is misrepresenting the halacha. If that's the concern, then it's not so hard to get around that, right? First of all, the simple thing is after the kiddushin, we say, now as an expression of the woman's acceptance or desire or whatever nice words you want to use, right? You can come with some formulation, right? A token of her love for Joe, right? An expression of her love. So she's now going to give. Or is a token of the mutuality of their relationship, whatever you want to say, right? Now she will give this ring to that, right? Now, what according to this should not happen is she shouldn't say any lashon, which is mashma kiddushin, because that would go back to the problem of misleading, right? If she says ve'erstich li la'olam when she gives it, something like that, so then you have a problem because you're creating the misimpression. Right? Even though halachically it doesn't damage the kiddushin that happened, but I think that there is an issue of we don't want to misrepresent what the halacha is. Right?
Well,
so
the worry there is we're going to misrepresent the halacha, and people watching are going to then
right, and they say, okay, so the woman can also be mekadesh. So, right, so you could see how it could lead to that. Dov Linzer has an article about a short piece about this. He has a very interesting suggestion. He suggests that at the time of the reading of the ksuba, right, after the kiddushin, right, the minhag Yerushalayim, for example, is there's kabbalas kinyan for the ksuba under the chuppah, right? The kanina, right? That's when the edim achotem. Most places, in Chutz La'aretz or outside of Yerushalayim, the Eidim Achotem at the Chassan's Tish, right? And that's where they do the kinyan, and then the husband gives the ksuba to the wife, right? Under the chuppah. But Minhag Yerushalayim is that under the chuppah, the Eidim sign the ksuba, and they do a Kabbalat Kinyan. What is the Kabbalat Kinyan? The Rav, generally, this is what generally happens, acting as the shaliach of the Kala, takes a handkerchief and the chasan is mitchayev. The chasan, that's kabbalat kinyan. It's to reinforce the fact. You have to see what happens to the ksuba, right? The ksuba is misha'abed. It puts a lien on whatever property the chasan has, and property that he doesn't even have yet. The kanayu, the atid ana lemiknaya, right? Nobody knows how that works halachically, but it's even thing, right? But it puts a lien on on his present property and his future property. Okay? How is that lien created? So normally, according to the letter of the law, the mere transfer of the shtar, when he gives the shtar to the woman, she's also koneh with the shtar. This is standard shtar kinyan. She is koneh, the lien on his property. To reinforce that, they do a kinyan sudar. That means he's moshech the sudar. He's moshech the kli that the Rav gives him at the shlichut of the woman. And when he receives the handkerchief, he's makne to the woman the shibudim. That's how she acquires, that reinforces her acquisition of the lien on the property. Okay? That's the financial transaction that occurs. Yes? So this is what Dov Linzer suggested. Instead of the Rav being a shaliach of the woman to do the kinyan chalipin, let the woman give something to the husband directly, not through a shaliach. Nothing wrong with that. And let her give a ring. It doesn't matter what she gives. Right? So let her give a ring and say, right? And say what's happening. It's a purely halachic act. It's perfect. Just say, I am giving you this ring, right, in order to reinforce the obligations that you're taking upon yourself in this ketubah, Kedat Moshe Yisrael. What does it say in the Ksuba? Kedat Guvran Yehudaim. That's what it says in the Ksuba, right? As it said, Kedat Moshe Yisrael. Havadila into Kedat Moshe Yisrael. So I'm saying, okay, I'm giving you this ring to reinforce your mechuyavut Kedat Moshe Yisrael. Put it in some nice way that doesn't sound so legalistic, right? And then you can do that, and it's a perfect double ring ceremony. It doesn't misrepresent anything. It actually explains what's happening under the chuppah. Right? That's what Dov Linzer suggests. Okay, it's very good, and it answers the main concerns of Rav Moshe. Obviously, Rav Moshe is kishkas. Right? If you read the tshuva, you're not so happy about it, but that addresses very clearly his concerns. And there's no issue of min hagayim or anything like that, because Goyim would never do something like that. Right. Whatever. Okay. So that's what we have. That's what we have
why
here.
isn't it done? Have you ever seen it done?
The objections.
No.
We went through this with kids recently.
Yeah.
And
So
we
what
were told by rabbis that was still misleading. That no matter what you said, doing that. So at the time of the Super was that there would be people who would understand it as a double ring ceremony.
It is a double ring ceremony, but it's not a double kiddushin ceremony.
Who were, they felt that it was too close to.
Really?
Yeah.
All right, that's a judgment call.
And they
think that would
didn't
be good
agree
enough.
to any ring at any time under the chuppah?
No, but
Because there are many.
they did rings onto the chuppah, but I think that the women gave the men rings at the very end.
At the very end.
So
I have to go back to the video.
Yeah, go ahead to the video. All right. But this is, I think it's a very good eitzah, is you actually find a halachically significant action. As actually there is something happening that's, if that's important to you. Some people, they don't care what that thing is. It's important.
At the time,
What?
we discussed the option.
Okay.
At the time.
All right, so let's stop here. Let's take a 5-minute break. And then there's a small little piece in the Mea Shiloach, which is relevant also to how halacha works in this week's parasha. Okay?